Now for the final segment of the presentation for this module, Intro to Assessment. So we'll first do a quick review of characteristics of norm and criterion reference scores and the type of selected responses: binary, multiple choice or matching, and constructed response, which would be a short answer, fill in the blank, or an essay. Some terms to know might be norm. Well, that is performance compared across the general population. So a norm referenced assessment would be comparing scores to another population. Probably the same other students of the same age or other classrooms of the same grade in the district. Now, a criterion reference, it answers if a student has achieved mastery of a skill. So it's not really comparing the performance of in general to another student or another class. Criterion references, did you meet the expected mastery? So we use these kind of standardized tests to measure aptitude, which is an IQ test, cognitive ability, or achievement, which would mean how, in terms of skill level, how is the student performing in, say, math computation, addition, subtraction, multiplication. And that would go across other content areas such as reading, language, written expression, or oral language. Now, what are the characteristics of these assessments? Well, the thing about a standardized test is, just like it indicates, it's administered, scored, interpreted the same way for everyone. So it has a standardized administration, meaning the room is similar, the directions are read verbatim, and the time is exactly set the same for all students taking the test. So it can be a criterion referenced or a norm referenced assessment. They can both be standardized in administration. But there's also standardization of the interpretation, meaning that the raw scores are converted when compared to the scores of other people and generally presented within a bell curve. So what are some standardized tests? You can probably think of some. Perhaps the SAT, the ITBS, and SAT-9. Students are scored and compared nationally, which would mean it was norm referenced. Usually commercial companies produce these assessments. There are state-developed standardized tests, which used to be the CRCT, but now the Milestone, or we used to have a Georgia High School graduation test, but now we have the end-of-course tests. They're mostly criterion referenced, so looking to see a certain level of mastery on specific questions based on standards that were taught to the students. Part of accountability mandates, and schools are compared to other schools in the district based on this information. We often call these high-stake tests. So how do we interpret these standardized scores? Well, we have a group-focused interpretation. How did the class, grade, school, state, etc. perform as a whole? And then you can also oftentimes look at one student and compare to other students of the same age. So one test may be used to make many kinds of interpretations, or it may focus on a single kind of interpretation. Here are some different types of statistics in which we use to interpret scores. I'm sure you understand these terms, but it would be important to take note if you don't or look them up. But a mean score is essentially the average of the scores. So it's all the scores get added up and divided by the number of scores there were, and that will give you the mean score. The median score would be the score if the numbers were put in order. It would be the middle score. Mode is the one that happens the most often. So if you had 4 13s and 2 14s and 1 16, 18, 21, the mode is 13 because there are 4 of them. The median is 14 because it's the middle number when put in order. And the mean is 15 because that is the average. Range is the difference between the lowest number and the highest number. And standard deviation is the average distance between individual scores in a group and the group mean. So if the mean is 15 and you scored a 21, that is compared, your 6-point difference would be compared to whatever the average difference a score would be from 15, which looks like it'd be about probably 1.5. So if you're 6 points off from the mean, then you would be about 4 standard deviations from the mean. Therefore, that would be significantly far from the mean. However, 14 would not be very significantly far from the mean and not very different from the mean. And so here's how we might look at a group comparison. This box chart shows us what the mean score, and it shows us the range of scores. And this shows us the first and top half and bottom half of the score surrounding the mean. So what do we get from this information? We get the range, the mean, but how is it useful? What can we figure out from looking at this? Well, we can see that students who are Caucasians don't have a very big spread of scores, and they all score pretty much in this tight range, and it is at the high end of the scores of the other subgroups. And we can see that the lowest score was a Hispanic student, and we can see that the highest score was a non-economically disadvantaged student. We can also see that the spread is bigger for Hispanic and African American and emotionally or economically disadvantaged student, but they all seem to score very similarly, whereas Caucasian and non-economically disadvantaged also score similarly. One thing that's important to be able to do is to determine a student's age in order to convert raw scores into those standard scores. Standard scores are generally going to be presented to you in a chart. So when you get your raw score by adding up the number of points a student earned, you compare that raw score to a chart to get a standardized score, but you have to pick the chart that is based on the student's age. So you determine age by doing subtraction, where you have write the test date. So if today is the 12th, you would put 2019, 8, and 12 here. And the birth date of the person, let's say my birthday, 1974, 6/27, and you subtract it. I'll show you an example. Okay, so here we have this test date, if it were today, and then the year, month, and day of my birthday. But we can't, if we have 12, we can't subtract 27, and we're not working on a base of 10. If we borrow a month and make that 7, how many days will we retrieve from 1 month? 30. So we have to add 30 to 12 and get 42, and we take 1 month away. So if we subtract 6, we can do that. But if say this was a 5, for example, we would have to take a year away, and to add how many months will we get from 1 year? 12. So that 5 would turn to a 17. But we didn't, because this is possible. So my age is 45 years, 1 month, and 15 days. So it's important, you will have to know how to calculate an age by doing this method. All right, so we have different individual score interpretations. We look at percentiles of these scores, grade equivalent scores, and standard scores. We'll go through each quickly here. A percentile score, that's mostly common for a standardized score, and that is essentially, it compares a student's group to others in the group, a student's score to others in the group. Essentially, it indicates what percentage of the norm group students outperformed others. So if you got 50th percentile, that means the student performed better than 50% of the students who took the test. It doesn't mean you got a 50 or got half of the questions. It does not mean that. That would be a misinterpretation of percentile. A 50th percentile means that they scored better than 50% of the group, or right there in the middle, right there at the mean. Using a bell curve is how we interpret this. So you can see average is right in the middle. That's 50th percentile. Above average would be anything above that, and below the average would be anything below a 50th percentile. But essentially, only the bottom 12 percentile indicates a very significant low score, and the top 12% would indicate a significant above average score. So it's a little tricky to think that the average range is going to be pretty wide with a percentile. So if someone gets a 75th percentile, that's, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is significantly high, which it would seem like it was, because it's in the top half of the people scoring. All right, we can also look at grade equivalent scores. These scores represent grade level progress. So essentially, if a student gets a grade level score of 8th grade, that means that they scored the same raw score as an 8th grader. Doesn't mean they got the same questions that the 8th grader got correct. It just means their score was the same as the average 8th grader's score. So Bob, a 3rd grader, has a grade equivalent score of 8.1 on a math test. That does not mean that he can do 8th grade math problems. That means that his average score, his raw score, was the same as the average 8th grader's score. Okay, doesn't mean he's ready to do 8th grade math, but does indicate that his raw score was higher than a 4th grader's for sure. And that math is a relative strength for this fella, Bob. Okay, so let's look at another example. Here's Joan. She took a standardized test of reading. Based on her reading profile, how would you explain her scores in each area to her parent? Well, you might say that in word recognition, she scored the same as her peers in 4th grade. So she is right on target for word recognition. And if you want to continue with strengths first, you might say vocabulary is a relative strength for her, that her raw score was the same as the average score of a 10th grader, as well as silent reading, that her score was the same as the average 8th grader. It's important to be careful when you tell this to parents and make sure they know that this doesn't mean that she has the full vocabulary of an 8th grader. She might know some 12th grade words, and she might know some 10th grade words, but there might have been some 8th grade words she didn't know. So it doesn't necessarily mean she answered the same vocabulary correctly as an 8th grader. It just says that the raw score was the same. And then an area that she needs to focus instruction on might be spelling, because her raw score was lower than the average raw score of a 4th grader. It was the same as the 2nd grader. And then lastly, for professionals, best interpretation would be the standard score. Sometimes it's not presented to parents because they don't understand standard deviation, which would help you understand standard score. But like I said, it is just, if you look at the average distance from the mean that students scored, so everyone has a different score. It's called variability. And so it's really the average variability of the scores, and how does your score compare to the average distance a person scored from that mean. But they do allow for comparison for professionals if you can understand how to do that. So we can look at the common types of standard scores and how it looks under the normal distribution. And I would say generally we're looking at average, above average, or below average for students and the normal distribution. A standard score of 100, mean of 100, has a standard deviation of 15. So you would expect expect someone to fall with 17 points below or 17 points above. So an 85 to a 115 would be average. If you have a T-scale where the mean is 50, you have a standard deviation of 10. So a score of 40 to 60 would be average. We'll talk about that more when we meet in class, and you can ask questions regarding how those standardized scores on under the normal distribution with a standard score would be used and interpreted, but you can have a general sense right now. Okay, how do we compare these? Well, percentiles are easy to interpret, but the norm group quality is very important when you're looking under that bell curve. For grade equivalent, it's easy to communicate to parents, but it can often be misinterpreted. And standard scores, they do equalize the difficulty in scores from different test forms, allows for comparison. For professionals, it's very useful, but it is very difficult to interpret by parents. So in terms of interpretation by non-professionals, percentiles, easy, then grade equivalent, and then standard. But for professionals, the most useful is going to be the standard score. All right, but what do standard scores tell us? Well, it depends on the validity of the test and how the student did on that test. And information about how a student's performance compares to other students or the curriculum can be useful, but we do just have to remember those caveats if the test has to be valid and how was the student performing on that particular day. So we can discuss that further as well. There are, requirements in the special ed law that we use a non-biased assessment. So it is important that we consider the administration of the test and how we interpret it based on that. Okay, so that is the end of this module's presentation. I look forward to seeing you the next time. Otherwise, have a great week.